Alright guys, here we are with the real 5.3. In my last video I identified the 6.2 as a 5.3 because I had the 5.3 on my mind. So we're going to get that straight. This Jeep's got a lot of stuff. My guess is it's an Expedition Jeep. We got an L82 LT 5.3 in this Jeep. And this is not ideal, guys. It is getting hot here in Vegas, and this Jeep's not overheating, but it's definitely running warmer than it should because that grill is blocked. Guy's got a lot of cool stuff on this Jeep, a lot of weight, and the 5.3 really doesn't have any issue hauling that weight around. Let's take a quick look under the hood. So if you saw the previous video, you'll notice that the LT 5.3 and 6.2 look virtually identical. They both have the LT1 intake. We got the Motec battery tray, coolant bottle. This one doesn't have hydraulics like the last one, but other than that, they're virtually identical. All right, guys, let's keep this straight. I mixed up a couple of engines in these Jeeps. The vehicle I'm driving right now has an LT 5.3, and the vehicle I drove in the previous video had an LT 6.2. I got them confused. But everything applies from the last video that I said about the LT 5.3 to this Jeep. So we're going to talk about the LT 6.2 in this Jeep, and that will apply to the other Jeep. I hope that makes sense. So I made my argument for the LT 5.3 being enough engine for most JKs. Now that's not saying it's enough for all of you. Some of us want more power. I will say that the LT 5.3 does downshift more than the LT 6.2, especially on the grades with a heavy Jeep. Now I don't think there's any arguing that the LT 6.2 is, for all intents and purposes, top of the line. Yes, there are better motors, there's more powerful engines and all that, but I'm talking about just for the average JK swap and maybe even JL. The LT 6.2 has a lot going for it. It never feels like it's struggling. It doesn't downshift that often. It's got perfect drivability. Pretty much anybody will drive it anywhere. But the biggest thing about the LT 6.2 is just how low stressed it is. The LS 5.3 was a good engine, but in a heavier JK, as we discussed, it would downshift quite a bit. It's a small displacement engine. It's only 1.5 liters bigger than the 3.8. And you definitely notice that the larger displacement engines pull the grades and hills with more ease. The thing about the LT 5.3 is it has the advantage of the 10-speed, the direct injection and all that. But the 6.2 just cruises. There's not many times it's under a lot of stress where it has to downshift, unless of course you're getting into the throttle and flooring it to pass or race or whatever. But pretty much other than that, it's basically the engine that's going to get you from point A to point B with the least amount of drama. When we talk about the LT 6.2s, we started life with the L86, which came out in 2014. The original L86s, at least a lot of them, came with a 6-speed transmission, and it pulled them pretty good. But very quickly, GM moved into the 8-speed transmission, and the higher-end vehicles like the Denali's and the Escalades got the 8-speed pretty much before everything else. As time evolved, they went to the 10-speed in about 2018, and the 10-speed makes any engine's life a little bit easier, whether it's a 5.3 or the 6.2. It has more diverse gearing. So the L86 has 11.5 to 1 compression. That's pretty massive, guys. And it has direct injection, it has continuous variable valve timing, it has a dual stage oil pump, it has all the basic technology that the LT engines offer. And besides the L86, the other most popular LT 6.2 is the LT1. The LT1 and the L86 share a lot in common. In fact, we do a lot of L86s that I think are LT1s because I really can't tell the difference how they run. We do fit the LT1 intake on the L86 for packaging. It looks cooler, it gives you more clearance to the firewall, especially in the early JKs that had the smaller tunnels. The LT1 intake promotes airflow. There's just a lot of advantages to it, and it's relatively inexpensive. So when we fit the LT1 intake on an L86, you'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference between the two engines. Now there are differences. They run different oil pans. The LT1 has a water-to-oil engine oil cooler on the driver's side of the oil pan. As previously mentioned, we removed that, we put a bypass plate in, and then run the oil out to an external cooler on the frame rail. The L86 has the traditional small cap that doesn't block off because it does bypass the oil around it. But if you're not running an oil cooler, which a lot of the LTs don't, then you can cap off the L86 quite easily. If you do have a heavy Jeep, you got the bigger tires, then I do recommend you run an external oil cooler. The L86 does not run, in general, a power steering pump, just like the LT1. Most of the trucks and the cars now run electronic steering. So that makes the accessory drive a little bit cleaner. But the L86 does run a belt-driven vacuum pump, and I'm a big fan of that. The belt-driven vacuum pump basically puts vacuum out if the engine is turning. So unlike some of the V6s that run that off-board vacuum pump, in the JK it's the one under the bumper that you relocate, that's designed to give you vacuum because the smaller engine's going to be floored a lot, which means it loses intake manifold vacuum, and if it loses intake manifold vacuum, you lose your power braking. So they added that little booster pump. But we find with the LT engines, they put out plenty of intake vacuum. So when you go to the LT1 intake, that's another bonus, is you do get that vacuum port. But if you want to run the vacuum pump on the L83 and the L86, you can. Now there is one caveat. The vacuum pump works just fine. It's on its own little belt. It's a small, I believe, 3-groove stretch belt. It's a very clean setup. But if you're going to run a big bore box, you're not going to be able to run the vacuum pump because the big bore box is going to interfere with it. If you have the big bore box, you can run the LT1 intake and then run the vacuum port in the back of the intake. If you have a standard size gearbox, then you can run the vacuum pump, which I do recommend. So we've been doing a lot of L86s because the price has been right. It's not dramatically cheaper than the LT1, but we were able to get them for, I don't know, $1,000 or $2,000 less than the LT1s. The LT1s are going up in price now. I think they're pushing between $9,000 and $10,000 as of this video, and I can assure you they're going to go up again. The supply of L86s is starting to dry up. They were plentiful for a while, but like I said in my L83 video, the L84 and the L87 are starting to take over. So we're seeing our suppliers, our GM suppliers, now have L84s and L87s when they used to have L83s and L86s. And as far as the LSs go, they're getting rare as hen's teeth. GM is still pushing out the LS3. There's still a few 6 liters out there, but for the most part, the LS3s, as far as new GM crate motors, are getting hard to find. And the prices in wrecking yards are going up. So the writing is kind of on the wall. We have to move towards the new engines. I don't think you're going to find a better all-around engine when you consider performance, economy, drivability, wheeling than the LT 6.2. So if you're running a relatively light JK, or you're running an Expedition JK where you're not in a big hurry, the LT 5.3 is probably for you. Especially if you want to run the lower grade fuels, the LT 5.3 has lower compression. But if you're going to lay awake at night saying, darn, I should have spent the extra money and got the LT 6.2, it's not dramatically that much more than the 5.3. I mean, essentially the engines are very similar. But if you get the LT 6.2, it's something you have to drive to experience. The amount of torque, especially with a 10-speed transmission with 40-inch tires, it just makes any JK feel light. And when you're going up the big grades, you're going 75, 80 miles an hour, it just doesn't struggle. Even the LS 6.2s will downshift pretty quickly. The Hemis will downshift pretty quickly, but you'll see that the LT will hang on to that gear, phase the cam, and pull through it. Now, of course, at times it will downshift because it has to. But for the most part, the LT 6.2 is going to give you the most stress-free driving. So the LT 6.2 is going to remain king of the hill for a while, in my opinion. The LTs have proven very successful for GM, especially in their big SUVs. One of the fears GM had was going to a small, high-stressed engine, whether it's turbocharged. In fact, GM did develop the twin turbocharged straight six, just like Stellantis. But they kind of see their battleship SUVs, the Escalades, the Denali XLs, they see those as carrying the torch. You got the president driving around in them. You got guys out here in Vegas with the black ones, picking people up off the strip. They're luxury vehicles. They want the smoothest, most refined engine that they can put in those vehicles. And they decided that since a big chunk of their SUV market is these vehicles, that they decided to stay with a V8. The LT has been given the honor of being a step above most of the other V8s out there. Now, I'm not comparing it to the Mercedes and some of the really high-tech exotic V8s. We're just talking about the run-of-the-mill overhead valve V8s that we've been putting in trucks for decades, like the Hemi and the older LS. Like I said in the last video, if you want that extra performance, if you want that low stress driving, get the LT 6.2. Be willing to run premium gas and maybe get slightly lower economy than you're going to get with a 5.3. If your JK is heavy, you got 40s, you run at high speed, you tow, you run at high altitude, I recommend the LT 6.2 anyway. But if your JK is relatively light, you got smaller tires, let's say 35s, maybe even 37s, you're running at closer to sea level, take a hard look at the LT 5.3. Now guys, I'm sorry my videos are somewhat repetitive, but I'm getting these questions a lot from guys that aren't subscribed to our YouTube channel. And as you know, we don't advertise. Really, our YouTube channel is our only way of communication. So a lot of guys will send in a builder form and say, hey, I really don't know what I want. Do I want the 5.3 or do I want the 6.2? Should I go back to an LS? So I hope this video helps you make some decisions. We are going to take this LT 5.3 to the mountain because we already took the LT 6.2 to the mountain, and I hope it doesn't get too confusing. So we will see you in the next video.